Washington is Ali Vaez, who is the Crisis Group's Iran project director. Ali, welcome to the program. How close is the deal, do you think, to a complete collapse?
Look, I think it's hard to say before Iran comes back to the negotiating table. We expect that happens at some point in November. And Enrique Mora, EU's chief negotiator, is now in Tehran, and the objective was to try to set a date. When Iran comes back to the table, we will see if it comes back with no flexibility, with sufficient flexibility to be able to reach a deal. And that judgment, I think, would be preserved for the first few rounds of negotiations. So I think we will have a better sense towards the end of the year. But these talks could also get dragged into 2022. So it might not be a moment of collapse. It might be a process of collapse if Iran doesn't have sufficient flexibility.
Washington is clearly running out of patience. And obviously, Israel is playing some sort of role, people believe, in Washington's attitude towards Iran. Yair Lapid yesterday in Washington said Israel reserves the right to act at any given moment in any way. That is not only our right, it is also our responsibility. Iran has publicly stated it wants to wipe us out. We have no intention of letting that happen. And then Antony Blinken said that Washington has other options if diplomacy fails. Do you see those as real threats, or is it just more talk?
Look, the reality is that Iran is about a month away from having enough fissile material for a single nuclear weapon. It would take Iran just 1 month to do that. The nuclear deal had extended that window to 12 months, but Trump's withdrawal from the agreement pushed Iran to violate the deal, and therefore now Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon than it has ever been. If this negotiations, the stalemate in the talks continues for the next few months, the amount of time will continue to shrink. And I think at some point, the US will conclude that the nuclear deal's non-proliferation value is gone and there is a need for negotiating a new deal. But Israel might conclude that it needs to take military action. And there's obviously plenty of risk of miscalculation on all sides in a scenario like that. So I'm still hoping that the parties will go back to the table with flexibility on both sides and would restore the original agreement, which remains the least costly option, I think, for everyone.
Every single time Iran is asked why it's violating the deal, whatever that particular violation might be, it always comes back to, hold on, this is Washington's fault for unilaterally withdrawing and also the EU's fault for not doing enough to keep the deal going in its original form. Are either of those justifiable defenses, in your opinion?
Look, the reality is that we are where we are because of the Trump administration's decision to unilaterally and without any good reason withdraw from the agreement. That is true. But now the Iranians have a set of expectations that I think are also unrealistic. They want an agreement that was signed as a political understanding to be set in stone with guarantees that that the U.S. would never again renege on the agreement. But that's an entirely different kind of agreement than the one that was negotiated in 2015. These set of mismatched expectations are the main reason that the talks reached a deadlock back in June when they went into a phase of suspended animation. And if the parties come back to the table with the same red lines or new red lines, and even with less flexibility, then the talks are doomed to fail this time around as well.
How badly have American and international sanctions affected the people of Iran? And then added to that, is it going to make any difference to the government in Tehran in terms of the pressure to come back to the negotiating table and have the full nuclear deal, which means that those sanctions can be lifted?
I mean, reality is that the Iranian people are the main victims of this standoff. They're the ones who've suffered the economic consequences of sanctions. But at the same time, the U.S. has almost thrown every single sanction that it had. It's an arsenal towards the Iranians, but the Iranian economy has survived. It has suffered a lot, and the Iranian people have suffered a lot, but Iran did not become another Venezuela. That's why the new Iranian administration, the Raisi administration, seems to believe that time is on its side, that the U.S. leverage has peaked, and therefore, with more time, it will gain more leverage and would be able to extract more concessions from the US. I think that's a miscalculation. Again, both sides would have to understand that status quo ante is not entirely restorable, but restoring the deal is still better than all the other alternatives. We have seen this movie before. Without a deal, we would get into a cycle of mutual escalation, which is defined by a race of sanctions against centrifuges, which in practice is a lose-lose dynamic for both sides.
Really, really interesting to get your analysis, Ali. Thank you so much indeed. Ali Vaez from the Crisis Group.